Greetings, my glorious Adeptus Custodes. Today I will tell you the truth, and it is, alas, not the truth that is known in every corner of the Imperium, for our dark past is full of bitterness and suffering. Well, Necrons. Understanding the Necrons is no easier than killing them. Despite numerous contacts with this force, the Imperium has never been able to obtain enough information to seriously confront them. However, one thing is certain: their attacks are becoming more frequent, and unless the situation improves, the Imperium's defenders will be completely unprepared for this new threat. The Necrons are a nightmare from another age. Their ancient empire existed millions of years before I forged a coherent Imperium out of irreconcilable human worlds. They were once mortal creatures of flesh and blood called Necrontyrs, but they have long since replaced their diseased bodies with sturdy forms of living metal through a process of biotransference. Not all Necron bodies are created equal, however. High-ranking nobles have been reborn in mighty shells, elaborate and with complex engram schemes. The commoners, on the other hand, were given comparatively crude bodies during the transformation, many not of their own volition, and their consciousness and reactions were dulled. The history of the Necrontyr is filled with hatred, fear, pain, despair, and betrayal. Millions of years before humanity arrived on Holy Terra, a race of sickly, cursed creatures known as Necrontyr struggled to cling to life under the mercilessly scorching rays of the blighting sun on their home planet. The star emitted massive amounts of radiation, drying and scorching the surface. Their world was uninhabitable. The Necrontyr were constantly suffering from radiation contamination. Their lives were a living hell of disease and fear of imminent death. As a consequence, their cities were vast complexes of tombs, with few temporary shelters for the living. The Necrontyr tried to overcome their mortality through science, but after 1,000 years, they realized that their bodies could not change enough to live on their own planet. The only thing left was to seek out new worlds to inhabit, for the sake of simple survival. Despite the fact that Necrontyr society was feudal, their race was still able to achieve some success in interstellar travel. They developed their own technology for space travel, which was slow and primitive, unlike that of the ancients, who could travel between stars in seconds. Because of the long flights, the ships were equipped with stasis crypts, in which the Necrontyr fell into a long sleep. In order for the ships to withstand the vicissitudes of space travel, they were covered in living metal. Many years later, as their empire expanded, the Necrontyr finally met those who would become their sworn enemies. The Ancients, a race of nearly immortal beings, superior in every way to the Necrontyr race. To this day, few people know what the Ancients looked like, and yet, according to some speculation, all of the races created by the Ancients, namely the Jokaero, Eldar, and Slann, bear a resemblance to their creators in one way or another. Their immortality and splendor ignited rage in the hearts of the entire Necrontyr people. They could not accept such injustice, for they lived in fear of their own sun, while the Ancients celebrated, basking in the rays of a grateful universe. There was no limit to the hatred of the Necrontyr, and that hatred would leave a bloody mark not only on both races, but on the entire galaxy. However, it's not all that simple. The Triarchy, the ruling council of the Necrontyr, led by the Silent King, Sarek, faced a huge problem. As the Empire expanded, the Necrontyr race gradually lost the cohesion that made them stronger. This led to massive civil uprisings, later called the First War of Secession. The rebellions were so massive that entire worlds fought for their independence. Then the Triarchs realized that only the presence of an external enemy could once again unite the people and unite the divided empire. As it is not hard to guess, the Ancients were the ideal target for this, and the Necrontyr were ready to unleash on them all their hatred, accumulated by thousands of years of suffering and torment. Thus began one of the bloodiest wars in the history of the galaxy. It ended the Ancients, gave birth to the Eldar, and changed Necrontyr forever. The war in the skies had begun. This devastating feud devastated entire star systems, killing luminaries, and despite their great numerical and technological superiority, the Necrontyr triarchy realized that they could not defeat the Ancients, who had mastered the warp so skillfully. Eventually, the Ancients drove the Necrontyr into the halo stars, and they became only a small problem on the edge of the ancient civilization. Failures in battle again shook the Necrontyr unity, leading to new schism wars, and eventually they were driven to the edge of the galaxy, to the far corners of the halo stars. The Triarchs were terrified. The war was almost lost. The people were divided. It was a catastrophe that nearly drove the Necrontyr to total extermination. In 1,000 years, their rage had cooled, but it had been replaced by an intense hatred not only for the Ancients, but for all life. Pressed to the edge of the galaxy, the Empire had fallen. There was no end to the despair of the Necrontyr and their Triarchs. The Necrontyr were on the verge of defeat, but the Ancients saw no need to get their hands dirty and did not strike the final blow, for at the same time the dynasties turned against each other again, unleashing the Second Secessionist War. Outraged at the fate to which the Triarchy had condemned them, the dynasties rebelled against the Silent King, and some were even prepared to ask the Ancients for peace if the opportunity arose. And when the death of an entire race seemed inevitable, salvation came from an unexpected direction. They studied the stars to understand their nature, in an attempt to find something to defeat their enemies, and he who searches long enough always finds it. The Necrontyr's gaze fell upon their own sun. Around it they saw a horrible creature that fed on the star. It was older than the Ancients themselves, but had little interest in the material world. The creature had but one purpose, to satisfy its endless hunger. The Necrontyr decided that this immaterial something would help them in their fight against the Ancients, since it was immune to conventional weapons. Under the guidance of Sarek, the Silent King, the Necrontyr managed to contact the creature. They named it Catan, which in their language meant star gods or star vampires. These powerful beings were attracted to their hatred of the Ancients and answered the call. The Catan are said to have emerged just after the universe, born amid swirling gases and unimaginable flows of energy, and were therefore rather immaterial, creatures of the ether. In their natural form, they are huge and can cover the surface of an entire star with their bodies, feeding on its energy. Over time, they learn to use transparent wings to travel between stars and continue to consume them. The Necrontyr realized that the Catan could not perceive their world without physical and material bodies, so they created them out of necrodermis, also known as living metal. This metal gave the Catan the ability to change the shape and size of their bodies at will. The Catan then traveled across the Bridge of Starlight into new bodies. Incredibly huge energy beings shrunk to the size of relatively small bodies. The Catan used the Necrontyr's hatred of the Ancients to wage war and consume living bodies, which they enjoyed far more than their past food of star energy. They also enjoyed the fact that the Necrontyr worshipped them as gods, which they took advantage of by making them their slaves. Over time, the Necrontyr began to regain their former power and gradually prepared for new battles with the Ancients. Then the Catan known as Mephetron the Deceiver appeared before Sarek, head of the Triarchs. The Silent King was not yet aware of the true nature of the star gods, and so granted an audience. The Deceiver spoke of a war between the Catan and the Ancients, played out long before Necrontyr was born. The Catan Deceiver made the offer each of them had been waiting for Necrontyr so long ago: immortality and victory in the war in the heavens. Sarek and Triarchy quickly agreed, which later doomed their race to more suffering. Mephetron deceived them by not telling them the true cost of such a gift. When the Silent King saw what had happened, he finally realized the true nature of the Catan and the fate to which they had condemned all in his name. Thus began the great Biotransference. The weak flesh of the Necrontyr was replaced by the same living metal as their gods. The Catan feasted amidst the flow of rejected life, gaining great energy and becoming stronger. It was unclear if there had been a rebellion of dissenters to the Biotransference, only that the upper classes had accepted the transformation gladly, while the merchants, artisans, and peasants were reluctant. The only thing that was clear was that the Necrontyr race no longer existed. It was completely extinct. In its place were soulless, cohesive machines. These are what we know as Necrons. There was no life or soul in the burning dead green eyes, only hatred for all living things. They had suffered, and now they made their enemies suffer. Only a few of them retained reason and memory. The lower classes had become nothing more than automatons. Clad in new metallic forms and stripped of the weaknesses of mortal flesh, the Necrons continued the war against the Ancients. In the process of biotransference, each of the Silent King's subordinates had been implanted with command protocols with which to rule with an iron hand. And now that Sarek had gained power over all the inhabitants of his empire, it was the Necrons' turn to fulfill their part of the terrible pact. Given that, having absorbed the souls of an entire race, the C'tan were now unstoppable, and with legions of Necrons marching behind them, the Ancients were doomed. Composed of metal, backed by the C'tan's might, and outmatched in technology by the Ancients, whose slow minds were unable to adapt quickly to the new enemy, they began to win. The Ancients' warp-based technology to teleport troops through the warp web was balanced by the C'tan's incredible energies, the Necrons' ability to regenerate, and the dry science of the Necrons themselves. Now the galaxy would blaze with green flames, and no one could escape their wrath. The war in the heavens flared up with renewed vigor. The Necron armies, supported by their powerful star gods, won victory after victory. It seemed that the Necrons were unstoppable. Having absorbed vital Necrontyr energy and gained new powers, the C'tan were virtually unstoppable and unleashed forces of unfathomable power. Planets were wiped to dust, stars were extinguished, and entire systems were swallowed by black holes created by the reality-changing powers of the star gods. The Necrons were able to move into the web and now pursued the Ancients across the galaxy. They destroyed the Ancients' greatest fortresses and overcame their magic and technology. This is what caused the Ancients to begin repopulating the planets with life, such as orcs and Eldar, who could aid in the C'tan War. However, in the end, the desperate Ancients were destroyed by the warp-born horrors known as the Enslavers that they themselves had mistakenly given free rein to. After the defeat and complete destruction of the Ancients, the Necrons won the war in the heavens, but their bloody harvest did not end there. The feud left the galaxy nearly devastated, stars extinguished, and worlds scorched. The casualties numbered in the many, many billions, but life continued to exist in other parts of the galaxy. And so the bloody harvest of the C'tan would continue. Still, the Silent King saw where this was going, and he was not okay with it. The extermination of all life in the galaxy would deny his people the opportunity to reclaim their souls and flesh. Terrified of such a future, he devised a plan to overthrow the arrogant C'tan. But Sarek realized that confronting the C'tan here, at the height of their power, was a suicide mission. The Star Gods had created weapons so powerful that they could not stand against them. So after waiting a moment, the Silent King led a rebellion against his gods, turning the C'tan weapons against themselves. Even so, despite the power of the Necrons, the C'tan by their very nature are almost impossible to completely destroy. They have been broken into shards, fragments of sorts, each trapped in a tesseract labyrinth. Each shackled and enslaved C'tan fragment possessed monstrous power, but was unaware of the great creature it had once been. The Necrons subsequently used these shards during battles, summoning the vast powers of their former gods to the battlefields. The devastating war with the C'tan, the rise of the Eldar, the Silent King saw the time of the Necrons coming to an end. Dominance over the galaxy is slowly passing to the Eldar. You can read more about this and the fall of the Eldar in the chapter of my diary, dedicated to their history. In the meantime, the Necrons, drained of blood by several wars, were incapable of standing up to the Eldar. But Sarez knew that the Eldar's time would end someday, as the time of all flesh does. So he ordered the remaining Necron cities to be rebuilt into huge stasis-bonded tomb complexes. Following laws of physics and geometry unknown to other races, the Cryptex created vast crypts that could house their entire people for 1,000 years' sleep. Countless interdimensional halls housed millions of Necrons, and spacious armories with the most powerful instruments of death. Though to an outside observer, it would seem impossible to fit it all in there. Having completed this part of the work, the Crypt Keepers installed temporal stabilizers to protect the tombs and everything inside from the ravages of time. In the event that a large settlement of a minor race gets too close to a tomb world, a coded program to protect the buried Necrons is triggered, instructing them to react with extreme aggression. The Necrons were ordered to sleep for 60 million years, and upon awakening to rebuild the entire empire that was once lost and restore glory to their dynasties. The king himself did not follow them. He destroyed all the control protocols he used to command his subordinates and left the galaxy, hoping to find something to redeem himself to his people. For all of 60 million years, the Necrons slept in their tombs. This period was called the Great Sleep. During this time, many tomb worlds were damaged or destroyed. Failures or unfortunate circumstances were to blame. Some tomb worlds were found and destroyed by the Eldar. Millions, if not billions, of Necrons were destroyed as a result. But in any case, it is time to awaken, to bring death and destruction to the worlds. But the awakening does not happen all at once. Some awakened during the Great Crusade, others during the Age of Discord. Whatever the case, most awakened in the later years of the 41st millennium, and billions of Necrons still sleep. When the last seal falls, the last star takes its position, and the last drop of blood falls, then those who slept the dead sleep will rise, and death will shroud the void.